Where have you come from, Jenny?
Near Epsom.
Oh, right, okay. That's a fair distance.
Yeah, 3 hours travel or so, 2.5 hours.
Called you Jane Tennyson then?
Don't do that.
Must happen all the time. Okay, I think that's the lights. Okay, we're on to the final session of the day. How are we feeling? Good? Excellent. That was really unenthusiastic. Whatever. Okay, so we are actually, we've kind of touched on this during the day, this idea of open access and the nature of data and what So what we're going to talk about here is open data and public benefit, and I guess we'll also be talking about the different ways that it might be used. And we have with us Jenny Tennyson of the Open Data Institute, which I think is Tim Berners-Lee, isn't it? Oh, you'll be talking about him? It should be name dropping during her session, which will be good. Just because it's worked really well so far, if you can remember to tweet questions, I think it's quite a nice way of getting lots of interaction into the discussion. So, Jenny.
Thank you. So thanks very much. I'm afraid that I have a bit of a cold, so I'm sorry if my voice is a bit croaky and if I'm sniffing and stuff all through. So yes, I'm Jenny Tennyson. I'm the technical director of the Open Data Institute, which is a not-for-profit organisation that helps organisations who want to open up their data or want to reuse open data and tries to help find and build the evidence base for why opening up data is such a good thing. And yeah, we were founded a couple of years ago by Professor Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt. As this independent institution, we have some seed funding from the Technology Strategy Board, but also funding from elsewhere, including philanthropic donors like Media. So today, then, I'm going to be talking about open data and the public benefit, and making the argument that opening up data has a massive public benefit, but it can also benefit the organisations that open up data themselves. So the first part of my argument is that you have lots of data. People don't, and organisations often don't realise quite how much data they have buried away within them. And when we're talking about data, we have to put up an obligatory data picture in which there are ones and zeros, that's the data, and they glow because it's exciting. Okay? Yeah, thank you. Right, so but that's not very, that's a very abstract kind of view of what data is. So let's have a look at some examples. What does data really mean to us? What kind of data do we actually have within our organisations? So one kind of data that we have within organisations is data about you. And of course, this is the data of most interest to organisations like the NSA and GCHQ. But we also have data about programmes, for example, what's on next, who stars in what, about events that are going on, when they are, where they are, who is speaking, about expenses and expenses claims, about maps. Maps are data too, and this is a picture of Openstreetmap, which is an open data project to build a map of the whole world. Types of data that we collect within organisations. We often don't think of them as data. We think of them as information that we can make available and we use internally, or that just gets squirreled away because we routinely collect it. And we don't really get the value, the true value, out of the data that we store. The second part of my thesis is that part of your digital audience is a data audience. So when you're thinking about who is interacting with you and who your audience is, then you should be thinking about who is interacting with your data and who your audience is for your data. So there is a demand for access to data, and one of the ways in which we see that demand is through apps that get built on top of data. And whenever we talk about data being reused, then people always immediately think of, oh yes, and that means that I can create an app that I can put on iTunes or whatever and make lots of money from. But that's not the only demand for data, and that's not the only use for data. Data is used on a routine basis, or could be used on a routine basis, by all sorts of people just in their jobs. Right? This is a screenshot, and the resolution on my slides got screwed up, even though it tested okay earlier on. So this is a screenshot of a particular piece of data that is floodplain areas. Those are the things that are highlighted in purple. And areas where there's new build housing. Those are the kind of red dots on that. So from which you can see that new build is still going on within floodplains, even though we know that they're there. This kind of data can be used by people who are planning, who are in their day-to-day jobs, needing to have information in order to inform the decisions that they make. We're not just talking about data for creating new apps, we're talking about data that can be useful in your day-to-day work. Another example is this one, which is a map that you can only see a part of an application that brings together data about how quickly fire engines, fire appliances respond to emergencies in different areas within London, matched up with footfall data about where people are in London during the day, which is, of course, very different from where people live in London, because people tend to commute in during the day. And this is used in order to inform a community discourse about which fire stations need to how the speed of response to fires in different areas of the city. Providing data that can support a community discourse and can support an argument around and a consultation about what to do in a particular circumstances is also really useful. So data is not just about apps, it's about planning in your day-to-day work, but it can also support communities. Different kinds of data can be shared in different ways. I'm going to go through a few different kinds of definitions here for data, because there's quite a lot. Because data is such a buzzword, then people put other words in front of data and it becomes another buzzword, and nobody really, there's lots of confusion between the various buzzwords that are all around data. So this is a curtailed diagram of big data, open data, and personal data. To illustrate the fact that big data is not the same as open data and is not the same as personal data, but these things all overlap. You can have big data, which is basically my definition of big data is anything that doesn't fit in a spreadsheet is big data, that is open, but you can also have it that's closed and within your organization. You can have personal data, which is any data that is about a person who is alive. You can have that be, it may be big data about lots and lots and lots of people, or about lots and lots of measurements about a single person, for example, if you have wearables. And that personal data is usually closed, but it can also be open if somebody chooses to open up information about themselves, and it can become open data. And you can have big open and personal data, that thing in the middle. You could theoretically have big open and personal data, although I don't think anybody is doing that really at the moment. Another definition, I'm going to try and change my resolution because this is really not working. Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, another definition is of my data, which you may have heard. My data is the idea of having access to your own personal information that is stored on somebody else's, within somebody else's system. So it's your access, and only your access, to your data. And this idea applies mostly to the private sector. There's the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act 2013, which grants the government power to insist on certain types of company on making this kind of data available to individual citizens. And it's things like having access to your electricity usage or your bank transactions. There's also a movement within government to provide access to your own data as stored by government. So, for example, you can have access to your own history from DVLA, your own history about the vehicles that you own, those kinds of things, and your licensing information. So my data is your access to your own data and only your access to that data. And it isn't open data. Open data is everybody's access to some data. Data sharing is another concept that gets constantly mixed up with open data. Data sharing is the idea of sharing data with a restricted number of people, usually for restricted purposes. And the reasons around that restriction can be for many reasons. It can be because of data protection. It can be because the data that you're talking about sharing is personal data. So, for example, the census is collected, as you know, every 10 years by the Office of National Statistics, and mostly that data can be accessed by researchers for very specific purposes and in very controlled circumstances for research purposes, but otherwise it's not let out into the big wide world. It has restricted access for restricted purposes to restricted people who are researchers in that case. There might also be reasons for restricting access because of security concerns over the data, or because there's commercial confidentiality wrapped up in that data, or, as is often the case, because that data is profitable and you want to be able to sell it only to restricted people under restricted circumstances, namely getting paid for it. Now, data sharing, particularly of sharing of government data, data that's collected about you by government, can be quite contentious. And in the last 6 months, and we've seen several areas where this has reared its ugly head, particularly around privacy issues to do with personal data, sharing of personal data, such as that in the National Pupil Database, which has information about every pupil that's been through school since 1996 in it, the VAT register, and also care.data, which was about the sharing of our personal health records with pharmaceutical companies, for example. Okay, so data sharing is restricted access for restricted people, for restricted purposes. Open data is neither of those things. Open data is data that is available for everyone to do anything with. Okay, technically it means that you can use, reuse, and republish the data that you get hold of if it's open data. And usually that means that the data is not personally identifiable unless somebody has explicitly said, yes, you can share this data or explicitly made it open. But much data isn't about people, it's about bus stops and train times and things that aren't about people. So sharing that as open data isn't a problem. And you can also have aggregate and anonymized statistics over data that is about people, like the census, which I talked about just now. The Office of National Statistics opens up all of the statistics that it creates about population, about what percentage of people are in interracial relationships, as it did the other day, in the news the other day. All of that is open data, open for anyone to do anything with. Even though it originated from some personal information, it's been aggregated and anonymized, so you can't identify an individual person from that data. So that data can be published as open data. And technically, this open data is what we would term a public good. And that means that everybody can benefit from it, and also the fact that I benefit from it doesn't mean that you can't benefit from it too. It's a non-rivalrous good in economic terms. We can all benefit from it. So what I want to argue now is that publishing open data, publishing data as open data and sharing it as open data maximizes the public benefit of that data. So I don't know if you know, but this is the 25th anniversary of the web. And over the last 25 years, then we've got so used to having information at our fingertips whenever we need it. If I think back to my childhood and needing to do a project on the Romans, for example, it would mean a trip to the library, and only those books that were there or in my parents' copious book collection would be able to give me the information that I needed. And I look at my 8-year-old daughter doing her project on Romans over the last weekend, and instead then she was able to get hold of a massive information from the internet, and a massive pictures and opinion and facts that would have just been completely outside my realm of possibility as a child. And we've got so used to this miracle that is the web, of bringing us information when we need it on practically anything. But the web is all about having access to information. As we what we're finding more and more is, as we realize the power of data, we are also realizing the power of tools that enable us to manipulate and understand that data quickly. This is a tool called Data Wrapper, which is used by a number of media organizations to easily and quickly create graphics and charts and graphs that summarize data, visualizations over data. And you really do just bung in the data and out comes something pretty that you can look at, but also that shows you extra information that you couldn't look at, that you couldn't understand by just looking at the numbers. These tools and a growing data literacy mean that access to data is becoming as important and revolutionary for us as the access to information that the web gave us. So we are more able individually to access and understand data, to draw conclusions from it. We don't need it to be, we're getting to a stage where we don't need it to be analysed by other people for us. We can perform those analyses ourselves. So we can benefit directly from data that is made available to us. And we could get to a stage where we have a web of data where, in order to reach a conclusion in our work and help us to decide what to do, we can get hold of the data that we need, visualize it, pull it together, in just the same way as we find it very natural to search on the web and find information that we need now. But the other point I'd make is that we also benefit indirectly from access to data on the web. Because in today's modern information economy, we live in a network of information where data can flow between different organizations, be wrapped into tools and services that then people who have no idea that that data even existed can then benefit from. So for example, if I publish data about public toilets on the web, then Google can put that into its maps, and then when I'm using, when somebody is using Google to look around a particular location, then they can find out where those public toilets are. Who benefits from that? It's the people at the end who manage to find out where the public toilet is and go to the loo when they need to. It isn't Google that publishes, that benefits from it. It's that wider population of people that use its tools. So data flows through this network of organizations to the people that need it at that time. And we shouldn't be surprised that the people who benefit directly, who most directly use data that is published on the web, are those who are most able to understand it and interpret it, but they are enabled to create new innovative tools, products and services that lots of other people also benefit from. Okay? So it's not just individuals benefiting from open data. Directly, it's also the knock-on benefits that we have to think about when we're talking about the impact of open data and why it is of public benefit. The final point that I want to make is that open data may benefit the public, but opening up data can also benefit you and your organization. And it does this if you need an argument for why that might be the case, then you only have to look at the web as an inspiration. This is a quote from Wikipedia that talks about how the first organizations that had websites were university departments, and they were all about sharing this research information between each other. But it soon became obvious that commercial organizations should be taking advantage of the web too and building a digital presence there to sell better, to reach out to their customers more easily. In the open data space, it's as if we're in a web. I sometimes say it's as if we're in a web where the only websites are those that are being created by government and by public institutions, because they're the only people that are currently on a routine basis publishing open data. But I can guarantee that over the next few years, we will see more and more commercial organizations realizing that they need to be on the open data web too, because it brings back benefits to them in just the same way as having a website brings back benefits. And I talk about 4 kinds of ways in which you can use open data within an organization and that it can bring you benefits. The first of those is by branding. Simply opening is a benefit to your brand. Simply by opening up data, then it shows transparency, it shows accountability. These are the arguments that are used often in government for opening up data, but they can apply just as well to commercial organizations too, especially those who are worried about their brand. So for example, Nike open up data about where their shoes are made, right? and what materials they're made from, and so on. That supply chain data. Another example is when Tesco said, and it had the horse meat scandal, they said, we'll open up data about our supply chains. Whether they've done it or not is another question. But the point was to demonstrate that transparency, to demonstrate that accountability, to enhance the brand. Because we value openness as a society, we value transparency, and we think that those who are open and transparent tend to be the good guys. Second thing is around innovation. We heard earlier in the day about the power of innovation and how that can bring new life into organisations and new ways of thinking. Well, opening up data is one way to inspire innovation in the public. So, for example, last year, Telefonica, who's a partner at ODI, were looking at publishing their footfall data, which they call Smart Steps, and they were looking at exploring the different kinds of ways in which that could be used. If they keep all of that data in-house, it can only be exploited and new products thought of within the four walls of their institution. By opening up some of that data, then they can spark that innovation externally, giving them new ideas and forging new partnerships, also giving them the opportunity to bring some of those ideas back in-house, potentially by buying people or whatever. So opening up data can be part of a longer-term strategy to increase innovation in a particular space. Third reason for why opening data can be a benefit to an organisation is the connection that it enables you to make with your customers, with your partners, with your suppliers. So, for example, a government opens up data about all of the contracts that are currently open to be bidded for, and if opening that up, making it available for everybody so that everybody can see it, opens the way for smaller organisations, which give them better value for money, to bid for those contracts in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. Opening up jobs data gives you benefits of being able to connect better with potential employees. Opening up the locations of your stores gives you a benefit of your customers being able to find you more easily. Okay? Opening up data can help you to connect with your customers, with your partners, with suppliers, to work more efficiently together. And the final benefit of opening up data is that it provides for a culture of open data. The more you publish openly, the more other people publish openly, and the more potential you have to reuse the data that other people are publishing. So, for example, everyone can use statistics from the Office of National Statistics. This is open data which is of relevance to every single organisation in the country to understand trends in population, to understand trends in business. And that data is open because we have a culture in government of opening up data. If we didn't have that culture, then it would be closed down. We need this culture to spread, to be a culture of open data across commercial sector as well as across the public sector, so that there's more information available so that we can work more efficiently together. So to wrap up, I'll just review my top points. You have lots of data within your organisation. Everybody, now that we're in this digital age, has lots of data of different types within your organisation. Part of your digital audience is an audience for that data, but different kinds of data can be shared in different ways. Publishing open data, publishing your data openly for everyone to access and do anything with, is a way of maximising the public benefit of that data. But publishing open data can also benefit you, and I talked about the 4 ways in which that can be done: by enhancing your brand, by enabling more innovation, by helping you to connect with customers, with partners and with suppliers, and also by fostering a culture of open data, which means that you can reuse open data published by other people. And I'll just leave you with this quote here. We're entering a new era in which people can use open data to generate insights, ideas and services to create a better world for all. That's what we're aiming for. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Jenny, first of all, thanks very much. I mean, it's a very comprehensive kind of look, but obviously underneath it, there's a lot of nuance going on. The one thing about data that kind of struck me when you were talking about Nike and just in general is that idea that those numbers aren't, they're open to abuse. And I'm thinking of this, my favorite program on Radio 4 is something called More or Less. Anyone listen to More or Less? You should listen to that. It's absolutely fantastic. But it basically blows apart lots of the kind of data that we think we know or that seems to be out there in a big way. And Nike wouldn't have put their numbers on if they didn't think those numbers were already going to be there. So is what you're talking about, it's a public good when you want it to be a public good, or are you advocating something more than that? That as a whole we should assume a starting point should be an assumption that open data is good, and then allow whatever else is going to happen. The closing happens later. I didn't quite understand that.
Okay, so I was using public good in the economic term, where good is like a product, right? Yeah. It's not necessarily good or evil, right? But it is a thing that we have, and a public good is one that that everybody shares in, and that where my use doesn't detract from your use. But in terms of whether data is used for good or used for evil, I think that they're, just like everything else in life, knives can be used for good and for evil. We tend to find that they are used better for chopping up vegetables than they are for stabbing people, and we tend to, in our day-to-day lives, use them for that purpose. Of course, there are some people who go around and stab people with knives, but we have other ways of dealing with them than to shut away knives for everyone. Right? And in that same way, then, of course, there will be people who create applications that are for evil, but we should deal with them as those people rather than by shutting off the flow of information that would enable them to do that.
I get that. I think I know exactly where you're coming from. I guess that what you're saying is there is something specific which has changed, which is that the access to knives in your analogy has increased enormously, that before we didn't have this data, and actually our problem at the start is that we don't have any sense of what this is for. We haven't had a culture of using data. We've had a culture where we've simply had no way of collecting it, or we haven't seen that as part. So that's the first step, is it?
So I think what's very interesting, actually, is that in certain realms of society, then we have had a culture of using data, and in particular, that's around statistics. And what's built up in the statistics community over a large number of years, over hundreds of years, rather than the short time frame that we're talking about now, is I think, two things. One is that the statistics community has a strong ethical code of practice. And I've heard it talked about for the data scientists and data analyst community should similarly have a strong ethical code of practice that recognizes this kind of good-evil distinction and tries to help people to understand that they should be operating ethically. That just because they can, for example, manipulate the front pages of a load of Facebook profiles and see what happens, doesn't mean that they should do that thing, that they need to have those ethical considerations when they're doing anything with data. The other thing that I think is interesting that's come out of the statistical community is a recognition that context is really important and meaningful. So when statisticians publish data, they don't just publish the stats, the raw stats. They publish guides and explanation that describes how it was collected, that describes all of the subtleties around that data, and they expect people who are interpreting that data to look at all of those subtleties as well. And I think that that's something that with maturity in a data analysis and data literacy sense, that we'll get to that kind of stage as well, to have a more subtle appreciation of what data actually means.
Okay, so step one of your public good is that data, if we collected data and we actually made that available, anyway, that would just be good. Collecting data in a systematic way with a degree of ethical, that would be a good thing. That's part of it. You're then suggesting that what you could do with that, it seems to be particularly interested in the collaborative side of it. We were talking earlier on that actually making it available and allowing other people to look at it and think about it and contribute to it. You're suggesting that the raw material that we've now started collecting in your data culture can now be used and taken off in all kinds of new ways. Is that?
Yeah, and I think that the collaboration aspect of open data is fascinating. If we look again with a parallel with open source software, what we find in the open source software world is that there are two types of open source software projects. There are ones where the code is written and then it is opened up for anybody else to take and do what they want with, but there's no dialogue back to the person or the people that have written it. And then there's the type of open source software project where the code is opened up and other people are encouraged to contribute and collaborate over that code. And what we find is that in those kinds of software projects, then they grow, you get new features, and you also squash bugs. You get better quality software because you have many eyes over that software. And the same is true in data. We currently live in a world where, we can take directly the parallel between Ordnance Survey mapping and Openstreetmap mapping, where Ordnance Survey mapping exists in a culture where you pay individual people to go off and you manage the entirety of your data collection, and then you bring it back into one big map. Whereas the Openstreetmap build of data around mapping is a model where anybody can contribute to a map that we all own, that is open data. And what happens there is that obviously people within a local area can contribute to that map, and they know that area very well, and they also can pick up on changes in that area very quickly. So you get a more accurate data product, a more accurate map with more features in it, because it is something that is collaboratively maintained with lots of people contributing to it. Okay,
and that's where potentially the contentious stuff comes in. The problem comes in that if I've just on the iPad just got a sat nav app, which is where people contribute when they're driving past an accident. They now press in. Okay. There's an accident coming up, and while the map isn't as good and there's an annoying voice, it's a great thing. But it's actually, if you're a business in the sat nav business, that's where you start getting the problems. Is that they would see the control of that data and the enclosed nature of that nature as a problem to then start sharing around. So your public good is a consumer good. It's not necessarily a business good.
Right. So it's certainly true that there are lots of industries that have profited from a kind of culture of closedness, of only providing data at cost to others. And yes, anything that undermines that and provides a public good, something that is open and free and usable by everybody, is a threat to that. It's a disruptive force. What we can hope for is that it's a creative destruction of that market, that it is a way of moving us as a culture forward rather than holding us back in the way that closed enterprises and monopolistic enterprises tend to.
All right, I'm going to come back to. Do we have any questions? Do we have any on the? Oh, we did. It's in Welsh. Do you speak Welsh?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Can someone translate that for me? Yes.
I'm just wondering if the Openstreetmap is available as an interactive map with Welsh names.
That's a very good question. You can certainly embed Openstreetmap into your website. I don't know about the Welsh names on it.
Okay. Was there another one? Oh, that was it. Okay. Any other questions? Any other points that you want to make? Yep, one here. Sorry, can you just wait to the mic to come? Sorry.
It was mentioned in the last session as well. If you're relying on the local community to update certain applications or maps and so on, we're expecting them to be able to do that and know how to do it already, or is there going to be some sort of initiative which allows these people to be able to update it without having to ask somebody else to do it on their behalf?
Right. So that's a good question about how do you support in a kind of collaborative model where you're asking people to update data. How do you support making sure that that's easy to do? What Openstreetmap do, although I'm not deeply embedded in Openstreetmap, so I may be wrong, but as I understand it, what Openstreetmap do is they address that in a few ways. One is that they have a very kind of intuitive, natural interface for putting in new mapping data, so that they try and lower the barrier for providing that information, including having things like easy to use applications that you can use on your phone, so that you can update the map, through an easy to use application very, very quickly. But they also run activities where they have like mapping parties and take people out to map because it's fun. And that kind of outreach activity is an important part of having any kind of engagement around open data.
Okay, let me just leave with the last question then. I mean, we're still getting a little. Sorry, I'm just a miserable old sod, but the contradictions element to me is still that this seems to me a really important session when we're talking about today. This is absolutely where the relationship between content and audience has changed. And it's one where collaboration makes every bit of sense, that data isn't just numbers, data actually is a representation of action and human beings and their behavior. But it seems to me that's the classic of where it's running up against a scarcity culture that we've had before, where the control over that knowledge and that data is the business. It's not something on the side. And you're making a very strong case that you can make money actually this way, that there is actually good business there. But it certainly does come at the expense, to an extent, of an old world, and those two things are going to crash. And we're seeing it, I think, around privacy at the moment. I would say is a case in point. But I would think, in terms of money, that's really where the economic values. Is this going to become a problem economic issue, or is this one where you think it will sort itself out and maybe we'll find a nice, easy mixed economy?
Yeah, so the exploration of business models around open data organisations is one of the things that we do quite a lot at the Open Data Institute. So, for example, we have a number of startups who are trying to operate in an open data world. And we find that there are different kinds of models of how you can both open up data and still make money. One example which I mentioned to you earlier on is thinking about opening up some part of your data but keeping some of it closed, and using that some part that you open up as a taster or as a hook into the larger amount of data that you might then sell. So the analogy is with having a restaurant, you want to make it very, very plain to your customers that when you're open, where you are, what's on the menu. That doesn't mean that you give away the food. It just means that you say where you can come and get fed. So in the same way, in a kind of cultural institution, then you might find that the metadata about particular video or sound or other kinds of media things is made completely available as a menu for what you might then want to actually buy, access to the video and the pictures and the sound and so forth. Okay, so that's one kind of model that you can use. Other kinds of models are around kind of service level agreement type models, where you provide access to the data, and the data itself is made available free to use and reuse and republish as much as you want, but you provide a service level agreement that says that if you want to have access to this guaranteed 99% of the time, 99.999% of the time, or whatever, then you have to pay for that service level to get access to that API at that level of guarantee. If you don't care about any guarantees, then you can just have access to it for free. But if you want that level of guarantee because you're relying on this as a business, then you've got to pay some money to do that. Or there are other models, again, taken from the open source community, where organizations might provide completely free access in open source to software, but then provide paid for services and consultancy over the top of that. That can happen in the open data world too, or mixed kind of licensing terms as well. There's a range of business models that enable you to still make money and publish open data.
So we're in the business of building a new culture that will involve lots of different layers.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Jen's going to stay with us because we've actually, for our last speaker, we've got Abe Adhikari, who's going to come up as a digital engagement specialist, who's going to give us a bit of a case study of some of this in action in the Leeds data mill. And then we'll take some final questions and finish the day.
Afternoon, folks. So today I'm going to attempt to answer the question, or rather ask the question as well, what is an open data state of mind? And I'm going to give you a couple of traits that we've discovered while working on the Leeds data mill. And I'm going to suggest that if you apply these traits when you're working in a team configuration or as an individual with open data, perhaps you can use open data for public good. So why do we need to have this discussion? Open data is becoming incredibly popular and topical, and there's a general belief that working with open data can help you create future-proof progress. But I also think that we need to look beyond the purely operational and the technical rhetoric and ask ourselves, when do we start applying open data? When is open data necessary to create meaningful change? Is it relevant as well? So this is when I bring in the 5 traits, and let's call this the open data state of mind. First, a bit about me. So I'm one of those people who has a variable job title. It usually has the word digital plus whatever the trend is at the moment. Stepping back from that, I'm interested in how, as individuals and organizations, we are building our digital identities. And more importantly, how are we using these abundance of digital tools to create dialogue, participation, and real change. For the past 6 months, I've been working with a fantastic team developing the Leeds Data Mill, which has received funding and support from Leeds City Council. Now, the Data Mill has 2 identities. In its digital avatar, it is an online repository of open data from many different sources. This is public sector, private sector, culture, heritage, arts, utility companies, and so on. But we've also been working on building a physical identity for Leeds Data Mill. This is through events and forums, because there needs to be an element of culture change, there needs to be an element of behavior change, so that people can start using open data in different ways. Leeds Data Mill has a 2-fold mission. The first is to encourage people to use open data to highlight what is the quality of life in Leeds. This is across culture, education, healthcare, well-being, employment, and transport. And then ask people to come up with ideas, solutions, services, and perhaps apps for how we can improve the quality of life in Leeds across these sectors. So it's a multidisciplinary approach. So what are the 5 traits of mind if I introduce them at this point? So the first is intuition. Second is critical insight. Third is curiosity. Fourth is problem solving. And finally, generosity. So I'm going to talk through each of these qualities, how we apply them, and what our learning was, and what are some of the more tangible outcomes. So intuition in the context of Leeds Data Mill is 2 things. First is, how do we start identifying what is the meaningful change that needs to happen with or without technology or open data? Secondly, how do we then bring other people on board to commit time, energy, and resources to do things with us? How did we embed or build the capacity for intuition in our project? We started with storytelling. So storytelling can mean many things. I'll tell you how we applied it. In the initial discovery period, when we were talking to lots of teams and departments and organizations, what I noticed was a lot of people, juggling a lot of different variables to make stuff happen in the present. At the same time, they have a future vision that they're working towards. And for some reason, I guess we're all optimistic, the future vision is always perfect. So we're working faster, more efficient, quickly, there's more resilience. So what we tried to do was use storytelling to connect what's happening in the present, which is a little bit of chaos, to a sort of a perfect future narrative. So in that scenario, can we start embedding open data as a strategic development resource? So it's relevant. So the first messaging that we put out was, open data helps you create evidence-based stories. What is your future narrative, or what is the story that you want to share in the present right now? Here's an example. So Leeds Museums and Galleries, they are the largest local authority museum service in England, and they have one of the most significant multidisciplinary collections. This is also a story that you may want to share. So we started looking for evidence to highlight the quality of cultural offering within this service. So the first thing we noticed when we got the loans, an open data set about the loans collection, was the service lends on average over 1,000 objects to other places. Now this is not just regionally or nationally. It's lending them to places in New Haven, in Madrid, in Amsterdam, in Tokyo, and in New South Wales. Now if you take a step back, with this narrative and the evidence, Leeds Museums and Galleries is no longer an isolated entity. It's connected to a global network of culture and heritage organizations, and many of them are actively shaping and exploring new trends. That's 3D printing, social interaction, digitization, open access, and so on. If you take another step back, now you have the story, you have some evidence, and you can start asking the right questions around meaningful change. So if this is the current scenario, how can we further enhance the quality of cultural experience in Leeds? That's the first question. If the service is connected globally, how do we offer new opportunities for a future workforce by tapping into these global networks? And finally, how do we develop a vibrant creative economy? Lots of choice, lots of questions. So what did we do next at the Leeds Data Mill? I'll get to that in a bit. Point number 2, the second attribute is critical insight. So in the context of Leeds Data Mill, critical insight means 2 things. Are we constantly, not in a tedious way, but are we interrogating the way we work? So one of the problems with technology is the next new shiny thing is always around the corner. And it's very easy to be seduced by tech and buy into your own narrative. So you have to keep reminding yourself, what is the change that we're trying to create? What are we working towards? Secondly, if we want to create genuine change, do we have an interdisciplinary network? Because it's not just the people who are comfortable with open data and can do things with it. It's everyone else as well who's part of the equation and has a valid role to play. So how did we build capacity? Well, we didn't use the I word, the innovation word. So again, in the early process of discovery, we didn't ask people to innovate without context. There's a sort of burden of expectation. What we said was, come and share your ideas, and then what we want is your commitment to work with us, to work through these ideas, and we'll help in any way we want, in any way we can, whether it's through connections, through access, and so on. The first way we implemented this was by running what I call an interdisciplinary hack. So we were very clear for this 2-day event. You don't have to be a coder. You might be, we call them thinkers and creators and designers. If you feel you are asking the right connections and you can join the dots up, come to our hacks. So the hack had about 40 people. That's between 6 to 8 groups. Every group had a mix of these different skills. And they were given challenges around healthcare, transport, and so on. And they were asked to resolve those challenges in 2 parts. Once again, reinforcing the message. How do you use open data to identify what the current scenario is, and then how do you improve it and make it better? So the learning for us after running this hack, And this is important in the context of smart cities, for those of you who are working on this theme as well, is that if you want public participation, if you want grassroots innovation, then yes, you need the ideas, you need the context, and once again, you need the commitment to get results. So this is when things start getting interesting. And that brings me to the third attribute of an open data state of mind, which is curiosity. In the context of Leeds data mill, that means, are we creating room for unexpected outcomes, or are we working towards predefined outcomes? And if that's the case, when is it that something new happens? So I'm going to introduce two new characters. These guys are called wet jeans. Now, they describe themselves as feral game developers. I don't know what that means, but don't let that put you off. They're some of the nicest, most generous people I know. They also have really good creds. So they've worked on open data projects for initiatives like the IATI, which is the International Aid Transparency Initiative. So they came to our hack, and they took public funerals data. This is when the council has had to pay for a public funeral. They did two things with it. The first, they created an infographic, so you can see the number of deaths per postcode. Then they created a game, and that was a clone of Flappy Bird called Lonely Bird. So what you're doing in Lonely Bird is each postcode, each level of that game is represented by a postcode, and the number of deaths are the number of barriers. So it is quite understandable if some of you go, what the hell? What are you doing? What are you doing with this data? But more importantly, there was someone else in that room who works with the voluntary sector. Now, this person looked at this infographic and said, hold on a minute. I can see how data helps me start a conversation about subjects that are considered taboo, no one wants to talk about, or simply unsexy. This is how I can reintroduce these topics into the mainstream. So now, Lonely Bird, the infographic, sits on a website which is dedicated to the project called Time to Shine. And the mission for this project is to tackle loneliness and isolation of older people in Leeds. And that's the website address. It's part of the Older People's Forum. So this is when you create room for something unexpected to happen. You come up with an unexpected result, and someone sees sense in that, and then a third thing happens. Which brings me to my fourth attribute, which is problem solving. Now, in the context of Leeds data mill, this means two things. First, we don't want to be at a point where we've developed some tech, we're working backwards, matching it to a problem, and then imposing a solution, because that creates more friction. Secondly, if that's not how we want to work, how do we build a bank of questions, any questions that can be addressed using open data? So the way we built capacity for problem solving was, wherever possible, we documented and shared our progress as openly as possible. It was also our responsibility to make a very clear case for people to come and engage with us. There's a lot of sense-making involved in the process of first coming across Leeds data mill and then figuring out what they can do with us. So we spent a lot of time there. That's why Leeds data mill also has a strong physical identity. The benefit for us was we wanted to create a culture of rapid prototyping. You develop something, you test it, you iterate it. If it doesn't work, you don't get too attached to it. Maybe you discard it and move on. So the way we applied this was we put out a very clear message that all ideas are valid and welcome. There is no censorship. So this is one of the questions we received, and this is from the Chief Officer for Culture and Sport within Leeds City Council. Brilliant guy. So he said, can we start using open data to develop a public arts strategy for the city? And is it possible to have an active process of citizen engagement in this process? Went back to Wet Jeans. By this time, we had awarded them a 3-month residency at the Open Data Institute in Leeds. And within 2 weeks, they came up with this really elegant solution. So this is a website that aggregates information. So how is this information generated? If you have a smartphone, switch on location sharing, take a selfie against what you might consider to be art, or take a photo of the object itself and then tweet it with a hashtag #LeedsArtCrawl with or without additional commentary. Now, this is still a work in progress. It's also a process of discovery. If you do want to crowdsource stuff, if you want to get public involved, what's the minimum viable action that they have to take for you to get useful information? So this is a snapshot of Leeds ArtCrawl. We've noticed a couple of sort of new trends. The first thing we've seen is that Leeds ArtCrawl, the simple snapshot, tends to reflect the mood of the city. So, you know, you might have heard we've had a big cycling event up north. So for the past 2 to 3 weeks, we've been getting a lot of hidden and unexpected artwork that's been developed around Tour de France. This further reinforces the point. So in the early days of development, we had a huge debate. Should we define what art is and then ask people to send us information? We decided not to define art at all, just encourage the action. So create a culture of sharing insight. And we're getting some really sort of delightful examples here. The third thing that has happened, so what you see behind me is a map which has an initial bunch of photographs that have been represented on a map by various users. This is still early days, but our ecosystem of problem-solving people is growing. So what started as a project by our game developers, now we have another person on board. I've used their Twitter ID, so in case you want to look them up, they're all there. So this is Ms. Shannon. She has a background in arts marketing. She saw this and she said, hold on, this could potentially be a really exciting tool for visual arts organizations who don't necessarily have a reliable metric to measure visitors other than the newsletter subscriptions. So she's now volunteering to embed the use of Leeds ArtCrawl. We're also appointing volunteers and ambassadors to champion this cause. I'm also going to bring in another example of citizen-driven, another citizen-driven project like Leeds ArtCrawl, and this is called the Road Roughness Detector. Now, this is an idea developed by the professor of creative technology at Leeds Metropolitan University. We're going to have a preview in mid-July. So the Road Roughness Detector hopefully will do what the name suggests. It is an app that you install on your phone, and it should gather data about the quality of road surface and send that back to Leeds Data Mill. So this is our second attempt at a crowdsourcing project. The utopian vision here is there'll be no more potholes in Leeds. So I've talked about two citizen-driven projects. So the final attribute is around generosity. So in the context of Leeds Data Mill, in the first instance, it's our responsibility to be open and transparent about how we are working. Secondly, can we create a culture where people who are working with us are sharing skills and expertise? For this, we devised a new event format, which is, it's called in numbers, so they're sector specific. We have a culture in numbers, we have a health in numbers, and so on. The strategy behind this is that fundamentally what this event is supposed to do is it's supposed to be a great leveler. No matter if you're from a large organization, if you run a small enterprise, or if you are an independent, you have a platform to talk about ideas, projects, and inspiration of what can be done with open data. So we've had people such as from the VNA, we've had the NHS, we've had Northern Ballet, but at the same time, we've also had startups like Curator Space. We've had a project which is looking at mental health and how you can use a whole ecosystem of digital tools to address this issue. We've had people from Acuity Design who's doing some fantastic work on wearables and user interface for the future. So by doing this, we're acknowledging that it is our responsibility to create opportunities for continuous learning and discovery so that ourselves and the community around us, we can create, test, and iterate. Secondly, we need to build a network of expertise to ensure we achieve useful results. And that's by creating an event which, like I mentioned, is a sort of level playing field. Regardless of where you are from, all your ideas are valid. Let's make sense of this. Let's make sense of them and see what happens next. So final points. What are the key traits of an open data state of mind? Just to reiterate: intuition, critical insight, curiosity, problem solving, generosity. And what has this meant for us at Leeds Data Mill? We've been able to turn ideas into experiments. At a higher level, we're trying to connect policy, strategy, and more importantly, real people. And the long-term vision is this helps us create real meaningful change. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again. That was a very interesting insight into an actual project, which is always delightful. Could you just give us a little bit more detail on the success stories you've had so far? Is any standing out as being, you would point to immediately and say, there's a provable, tangible example of where the data mill has really worked?
I think Leeds Art Crawl is one example where it's a successful example for a number of reasons. Firstly, because we've got a question from within a large organization, so that's culture change. Secondly, rapid prototyping. So from the question to an actual workable format, that took us 2 weeks. Third is getting more and more people involved. So I think when you're talking about open data, you cannot have a model of development which is exclusive only to you. You can't be the only person who's benefiting. So what we're trying to do is, if we get more people involved in the development process, is there room for different people to get something from it?
I think that's where a lot of the discussion today has been about the difference between soft benefits and those hard benefits. And I think actually both of you pointed to the fact that maybe that needs some redefining in itself. But that idea of you've now got more people on the creation level, you've got more collaboration going on. How do you know that translates into access at a different level? How do you know that how do you measure the idea that different people or more people are now engaging with art perhaps in a different kind of way?
I think there are two sides to that. So the first, in a smart cities context, so we are all operating around buzzwords, which is a point I think you made as well. So in the early days, I guess what we're trying to do is see if we take a particular buzzword, which is citizen engagement in smart cities, can that become a tangible action? So what Leeds Data Mill has shown us is, yes, if you get the context right, you can find people with considerable expertise in your city to develop prototypes for you. So what we'll do as a logical next step is maybe find 100 other examples of such activity, because we have to be mindful, neither the road roughness detector or Leeds Art Crawl by itself will change the world. You'll probably need 100 other ideas and 10% of them will succeed.
So just to be clear, because that is the cultural difference I think both of you are describing. If you think differently and you behave differently, it might be that projects start small, but they start inspiring other projects. So it's a kind of viral thing you're talking about here where, that's probably the wrong word actually, but I know what you mean. It's that idea of it might be works on a small level, but somehow that will grow and evolve so that the culture emerges rather than has to be imposed. Is that the theory?
It's also a case of managing expectations, managing relationships. It's all the old school stuff that's still really, really important, because as technology evolves, a lot of people feel they're being left behind. So if you are working with something like open data, you have to make a conscious choice that in the way that we are working, are we enabling people to overcome their anxieties and come on board, or are we further leaving them behind?
Right, and that's where in the last session we were talking about digital divide. What you're suggesting here, I think, is that when it feels like the real world rather than digital, when you've got things that you can actually see and engage with, that bit by bit that divide changes because people see it about them rather than about technology. Is that the core?
It has to be about them.
Okay. Did we have any questions from the floor? Is anyone? It's quite a big project. Is anyone doing anything similar using open data? Have any of you used open data on anything? It's because it is a long way, isn't it, culturally, I think, from where we are. You could see, hopefully some people here will be seeing the opportunities perhaps in their own projects, but it does seem like quite a big cultural shift, even if the way you paint that cultural shift seems very logical. It's still quite a jump from where we are today.
But the advantage is, because of the internet, there's probably someone else who's done what you're trying to do. So
Right.
there's lots of inspiration and evidence out there. It's a case of joining the dots. We were talking over lunchtime, and I think there are about 3 projects similar to Leeds Art Crawl, which is about crowdsourcing public art in the city.
Right. And what is, let's just leave it on this idea then. Maybe Jenny, you can kick off on this as well. What is it? Oh, we have got one here. Oh, well, there we go. That's nice. That's what you should do. Well, that's probably how it starts, doesn't it? It probably starts with a tweet saying, actually, why don't we do that? That presumably is part of the whole open culture, as that theory that anyone can pick it up. But what is it? Is it this? What is it that makes that jump that we're talking about? What is it that creates... I know you've talked about the psychology of this, but what is the specific thing that's going to make what I think is still a leap, even if you're leaping into something which is logical? What are the few big steps that are missing?
Few big steps that are missing. That's an easy question to answer. So I think that there are a number of there are two points that I'd make. One is that we have to have a growing data literacy, a growing culture of data literacy, and of course, in order to ensure that people are using open data on a routine basis. Now, currently, people don't use data on a routine basis at all. The vast majority of people don't use it on a routine basis, partly because they don't know it's there, partly because they don't know how to do it. So there's a gulf about people's data literacy and understanding what they could do with data if they got hold of it, and understanding what data is available for them to do something with on a day-to-day basis. I talked about how Office of National Statistics has a huge amount of statistics that is available as open data, which you could be doing things with. Every organisation could benefit from that data and could be using that data to help drive decision making. But instead, then we tend not to look outside the walls of our organisation. We tend to rely on our gut feelings and on the people that we talk to, rather than on hard data that we get from outside. So that's a cultural shift towards using data, a cultural shift towards understanding data and understanding what it can do for us. And that's a very long-term shift that we're.
Is that education, or is that practice, or what is it?
That's all of.
Right,
that's all of the above. So I think, yeah, I think that as usual, then starting young and starting with your kids. I'm trying to get my kids to. I don't know if any of you have children who are into the loom band craze at the moment, just running all over the place. Trying to get them to encode data into the loom bands that they make, to have an understanding about how you can collect data and turn it into art, right? And turn it into something that's tangible and a cultural product. Arguably, loom bands as a cultural product. So data literacy, embedding that early into childhood is one of those things. And the other bit that I was thinking of has completely left my mind. Oh yeah, that was it. We also have a culture where we kind of expect some quick wins to come out of data. So it's as if we expect to publish a CSV file and then within the next 2 weeks to have some amazing application that is using it in completely astonishing ways. True transformative uses of data will take years to build. They embed data within the systems that you use on a day-to-day basis, and you don't do that based on one CSV file that has been published. You base transformative applications on a known continuous supply of up-to-date information. And one of the major things that is preventing open data applications that are being built on open data is that there's no guarantees around open data being published in the same format over a long period of time, and that means that nobody's going to invest in embedding that data into their projects. So we have to also have a culture where we are making those guarantees when we publish open data, that it will be there on a continuous basis for a long period of time, and then also a culture of not expecting a bunch of hackers to come up with something in a couple of weeks that is going to be utterly transformational, because the real transformation is going to happen over a number of years, not a number of days.
Okay, maybe you'd just like to give us the last word, just on that little bit. Is there something that leaps out at you that you think the next year this is really going to be the one that works?
Crikey. Can I just instead reinforce the idea that if you are working with open data, it's the small steps that matter, and focus on what's the first small step that you can take, and then work towards the bigger change.
Okay, so we have a big future, but a lot of small steps first. Okay, that sounds like a good way to end this panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And we'll just finish the day on just a few thoughts. I think we said at the beginning of the day that we were talking about this conference as being about the intersection between people and technology. And I think we got a lot of examples actually for all the positive kind of thinking that was coming out there, a lot of positive energy during the day of the challenges that come out of that. That things, when we talk about making data accessible and making projects accessible, there still is an issue around a digital divide. There still are issues in which people are using, which people are making things. And I think we heard earlier on a very important point being made that theoretically making things available is not the same as actually making things happen on the ground. Access is not the same as engagement. And I think we heard in the last session, and in pretty much all the sessions, that if we really want to change people's minds, and we really want all of this kind of digital world to work, then we have to find ways to make people engage in a real level, and an actual level, and a physical level with the digital kind of innovation that we've been talking about here. Digital innovation itself, more ones and zeros, adding to that deluge of content that I think Microsoft were talking about at the beginning, does not in itself transform anything. It doesn't transform business, it doesn't transform communities. But I think what we're beginning to hear all the way through is the idea that what we need is a cultural shift. And that cultural shift can happen at all kinds of levels. I think at what we've been hearing just now is part of that cultural shift is if you make data available freely, if that's part of the culture that you live in, is that just an assumption that actually data is created all around us, and if we use it, that data is not ones and zeros in nice glowing numbers and graphics. It's people and it's behavior. And if only we can work out ways of connecting with the behavior, then actually we've got enormous number of opportunities. I thought actually the archive session put this very well indeed, and I think if there's one thing I'd say about that session, it's so much better than the vast majority of archive sessions we're talking about, because it took away straight away the idea that archives are about collecting up as much as we possibly can and preserving. It was talking about taking ideas and activating, reactivating, making people feel differently about what they're looking at. And I think that is where all through the day, going right back to the beginning of the Microsoft guy, you know, what is this new world going to look like that's so exciting? Well, a world in which anyone, everywhere, is able to access anything and can actually make it to an extent in their own image. They can interact with it. Discussions about in a world in a world of access to enormous power in terms of data and enormous theoretical access. The link between the theoretical and between the individual and the community, I think, is becoming blurred. All these lines are becoming blurred. Open and closed stops being the same argument that it used to be. It starts being about it stops being about business and culture. It starts being about interaction with human beings, some of which they'll pay for, some of which they won't. So I think at the end of it, we got a very positive message that came through, that there is tons of digital innovation, and if only we can make that connection between the people and the audience, if we can only interpose our ideas, our policies, our business into that space, we have an enormous opportunity. And I have to say that that enormous possibility is something that I think could accrue enormous benefits to Wales, both in terms of the individual life here in Wales. Going back to Leeds, there's no reason why we shouldn't be talking about the whole of Wales in exactly that same kind of thought. Individual communities finding new ways to live that are better and stronger. But I think we also heard there's an enormous amount of business that can be done both locally and internationally. So for all the challenges that are there, the one thing I'd say came through today is that as long as we focus on that audience, we have a great big future ahead of us. And if that's probably where we should be putting all of our attention when we're thinking about the development of creative economies and the creative economy of Wales. So that was my thoughts. I don't know if anyone had any different ones, but we could talk about it in a bar afterwards. That would be good. So thanks very much, and enjoy your evening, and I hope to see you tomorrow.